A floating city. Chapter 1. On the 18th of March, 1867, I arrived at Liverpool, intending to take a berth simply as an amateur traveller on board the Great Eastern, which in a few days was to sail for New York. I had sometimes thought of paying a visit to North America, and was now tempted to cross the Atlantic on board this gigantic boat. First of all the Great Eastern, then the country celebrated by Cooper. This steamship is indeed a masterpiece of naval construction. More than a vessel, it is a floating city, part of the country, detached from English soil, which after having crossed the sea unites itself to the American continent. I pictured to myself this enormous bulk borne on the waves, her defiant struggle with the wind, her boldness before the powerless sea, her indifference to the billows, her stability in the midst of that element which tosses warriors and solferinos like ship's boats. But my imagination carried me no farther. All these things I did indeed see during the passage, and many others which do not exclusively belong to the maritime domain. If the Great Eastern is not merely a nautical engine, but rather a microcosm, and carries a small world with it, an observer will not be astonished to meet here, as on a larger theatre, all the instincts, follies, and passions of human nature. On leaving the station, I went to the Adelphi Hotel. The Great Eastern was announced to sail on the 20th of March, and as I wished to witness the last preparations, I asked permission of Captain Anderson, the commander, to take my place on board immediately, which permission he very obligingly granted. The next day I went down towards the basins, which form a double line of docks on the banks of the Mersey. The gatekeepers allowed me to go on to Prince's Landing Stage, a kind of movable raft which rises and falls with the tide, and is a landing place for the numerous boats which run between Liverpool and the opposite town of Birkenhead on the left bank of the Mersey. The Mersey, like the Thames, is only an insignificant stream, unworthy the name of river, although it falls into the sea. It is an immense depression of the land filled with water, in fact nothing more than a hole, the depth of 3 which allows it to receive ships of the heaviest tonnage, such as the Great Eastern, to which almost every other port in the world is closed. Thanks to this natural condition, the streams of the Thames and the Mersey have seen 2 immense commercial cities, London and Liverpool, built almost at their mouths, and from a similar cause has Glasgow arisen on the Clyde. At Prince's Landing Stage, a small tug in the service of the Great Eastern was getting up steam. I went on board and found it already crowded with workmen and mechanics. As the clock in Victoria Tower struck 7, the tender left her moorings and quickly ascended the Mersey with the rising tide. Scarcely had we started, when I saw on the quay a tall young man, with that aristocratic look which so distinguishes the English officer. I thought I recognized in him a friend whom I had not seen for several years, a captain in the Indian Army. But I must have been mistaken, for Captain Mac Elwyn could not have left Bombay, as I ought to have known. Besides, Mac Elwyn was a gay, careless fellow and a jovial companion, but this person, if he resembled him in feature, seemed melancholy, and as though burdened with a secret grief. Be it as it may, I had not time to observe him more closely, for the tender was moving rapidly away, and the impression founded on this resemblance soon vanished from my mind. The Great Eastern was anchored about 3 miles up the river, at a depth equal to the height of the tallest houses in Liverpool. She was not to be seen from Prince's Stage, but I caught a glimpse of her imposing bulk from the first bend in the river. One would have taken her for a small island, hardly discernible in the mist. She appeared with her bows towards us, having swung round with the tide. But soon the tender altered her course, and the whole length of the steamship was presented to our view. She seemed what in fact she was, enormous. 3 or 4 colliers alongside were pouring their cargoes of coal into her portholes. Beside the Great Eastern, these 3-mast ships looked like barges. Their chimneys did not even reach the first line of light ports in her hull. The yards of their gallant sails did not come up to her bulwarks. The giant could have hoisted these ships on its davits like shore-boats. Meanwhile the tender approached the Great Eastern, whose chains were violently strained by the pressure of the tide, and ranged up to the foot of an immense winding staircase, on the larboard side. In this position the deck of the tender was only on a level with the load waterline of the steamship, to which line she would be depressed when in full cargo, and which still emerged 2 yards. The workmen were now hurriedly disembarking and clambering up the numerous steps which terminated at 5 the forepart of the ship. I, with head upturned, and my body thrown back, surveyed the wheels of the Great Eastern, like a tourist looking up at a high edifice. Seen from the side, these wheels looked narrow and contracted, although their paddles were 4 yards broad, but in front they had a monumental aspect. Their elegant fittings, the arrangements of the whole plan, the stays crossing each other to support the division of the triple center rim, the radius of red spokes, the machinery half lost in the shadow of the wide paddle boards, all this impressed the mind and awakened an idea of some gigantic and mysterious power. With what force must these wooden paddles strike the waves, which are now gently breaking over them? What a boiling of water when this powerful engine strikes it blow after blow! What a thundering noise engulfed in this paddlebox cavern when the Great Eastern goes at full speed, under the pressure of wheels measuring 53 feet in diameter and in circumference, weighing 90 tons, and making 11 revolutions a minute. The tender had disembarked her crew. I stepped on to the fluted iron steps, and in a few minutes had crossed the forepart of the Great Eastern. Chapter 2. The deck was still nothing but an immense timber yard given up to an army of workmen. I could not believe I was on board a ship. Several thousand men, workmen, crew, engineers, officers, mechanics, lookers-on, mingled and jostled together without the least concern, some on deck, others in the engine room, here pacing the upper decks, there scattered in the rigging, all in an indescribable pell-mell. Here flywheel cranes were raising enormous pieces of cast iron, their heavy joists were hoisted by steam windlasses. Above the engine rooms an iron cylinder, a metal shaft in fact, was balanced. At the bows the yards creaked as the sails were hoisted. At the stern rose a scaffolding which doubtless concealed some building in construction. Building, fixing, carpentering, rigging and painting were going on in the midst of the greatest disorder. Carpentering, rigging and painting. 7. My luggage was already on board. I asked to see Captain Anderson and was told that he had not yet arrived, but one of the stewards undertook to install me and had my packages carried to one of the aft cabins. "My good fellow," said I to him, "the Great Eastern was announced to sail on the 20th of March, but is it possible that we can be ready in 24 hours? Can you tell me when we may expect to leave Liverpool?" But in this respect the steward knew no more than I did, and he left me to myself. I then made up my mind to visit all the ins and outs of this immense ant hill, and began my walk like a tourist in a foreign town. A black mire, that British mud which is so rarely absent from the pavement of English towns, covered the deck of the steamship. Dirty gutters wound here and there. One might have thought oneself in the worst part of Upper Thames Street, near London Bridge. I walked on, following the upper decks towards the stern. Stretching on either side were two wide streets, or rather boulevards, filled with a compact crowd. Thus walking, I came to the centre of the steamship between the paddles, united by a double set of bridges. Here opened the pit containing the machinery of the paddle wheels, and I had an opportunity of looking at this admirable locomotive engine. About 50 workmen were scattered on the metallic skylights, some clinging to 8 the long suction pumps fixing the eccentric wheels, others hanging on the cranks riveting iron wedges with enormous wrenches. After having cast a rapid glance over these fitting works, I continued my walk till I reached the bows, where the carpenters were finishing the decoration of a large saloon called the smoking room, a magnificent apartment with 14 windows, the ceiling white and gold, and wainscoted with lemon-coloured panels. Then, after having crossed a small triangular space at the bows, I reached the stem, which descends perpendicularly into the water. Turning round from this extreme point, through an opening in the mists, I saw the stern of the Great Eastern at a distance of more than 200 yards. I returned by the boulevards on the starboard side, avoiding contact with the swaying pulleys and the ropes of the rigging, lashed in all directions by the wind, now keeping out of the way, here of the blows of a flywheel crane, and further on of the flaming scoria which were showering from a forge like a display of fireworks. I could hardly see the tops of the masts, 200 feet in height, which lost themselves in the mist, increased by the black smoke from the tenders and colliers. After having passed the great hatchway of the engine rooms, I observed a small hotel on my left, and then 9 the spacious side walls of a palace surmounted by a terrace, the railings of which were being varnished. At last I reached the stern of the steamship, and the place I had already noticed where the scaffolding was erected. Here, between the last small deck cabin and the enormous gratings of the hatchways, above which rose the 4 wheels of the rudder, some engineers had just finished placing a steam engine. The engine was composed of 2 horizontal cylinders, and presented a system of pinions, levers and blocks which seemed to me very complicated. I did not understand at first for what it was intended, but it appeared that here, as everywhere else, the preparations were far from complete. And now, why all these delays? Why so many new arrangements on board the Great Eastern, a comparatively new ship? The reason may be explained in a few words. After 20 passages from England to America, one of which was marked by very serious disasters, the use of the Great Eastern was temporarily abandoned, and this immense ship, arranged to accommodate passengers, seemed no longer good for anything when the first attempt to lay the Atlantic cable had failed. Partly because the number of ships which carried it was insufficient, engineers thought of the Great Eastern. She alone could store on board the 2,100 miles of metallic wire, 10 weighing 4,500 tons. She alone, thanks to her perfect indifference to the sea, could unroll and immerse this immense cable. But special arrangements were necessary for storing away the cable in the ship's hold. 2 out of 6 boilers were removed, and 1 chimney out of 3 belonging to the screw engine. In their places large tanks were placed for the cable, which was immersed in water to preserve it from the effects of variation of the atmosphere. The wire thus passed from these tanks of water into the sea without suffering the least contact with the air. The laying of the cable having been successfully accomplished, and the object in view attained, the Great Eastern was once more left in her costly idleness. A French company, called the Great Eastern Company Limited, was floated with a capital of 2 million francs, with the intention of employing the immense ship for the conveyance of passengers across the Atlantic. Thus the reason for rearranging the ship to this purpose, and the consequent necessity of filling up the tanks and replacing the boilers, of enlarging the saloons in which so many people were to live during the voyage, and of building extra dining saloons, finally the arrangement of 1,000 berths in the sides of the gigantic hull. The Great Eastern was freighted to the amount of 25,000 francs a month. 2 contracts were arranged with G. Forrester and Co. of Liverpool, the first to the 11 amount of 538,750 francs for making new boilers for the screw, the second to the amount of 662,500 francs for general repairs and fixings on board. Before entering upon the last undertaking, the Board of Trade required that the ship's hull should undergo a strict examination. This costly operation accomplished, a long crack in her exterior plates was carefully repaired at a great expense, and the next proceeding was to fix the new boilers. The driving main shaft of the wheels, which had been damaged during the last voyage, had to be replaced by a shaft, provided with 2 eccentric wheels, which ensured the solidity of this important part. And now for the first time the Great Eastern was to be steered by steam. It was for this delicate operation that the engineers intended the engine which they had placed at the stern. The steersman, standing on the bridge between the signal apparatus of the wheels and the screw, has before his eyes a dial provided with a moving needle, which tells him every moment the position of his rudder. In order to modify it, he has only to press his hand lightly on a small wheel, measuring hardly a foot in diameter and placed within his reach. Immediately the valves open, the steam from the boilers rushes along the conducting tubes into the 2 cylinders of the small engine, the pistons move rapidly, and the rudder instantly obeys. If this plan succeeds, 12A man will be able to direct the gigantic body of the Great Eastern with 1 finger. For 5 days operations continued with distracting activity. These delays considerably affected the enterprise of the freighters, but the contractors could do no more. The day for setting sail was irrevocably settled for the 26th of March. The 25th still saw the deck strewn with all kinds of tools. During this last day, however, little by little the gangways were cleared, the scaffoldings were taken down, the flywheel cranes disappeared, the fixing of the engines was accomplished, the last screws and nails were driven in, the reservoirs filled with oil, and the last slab rested on its metal mortise. This day the chief engineer tried the boilers. The engine rooms were full of steam. Leaning over the hatchway, enveloped in a hot mist, I could see nothing, but I heard the long pistons groaning, and the huge cylinders noisily swaying to and fro on their solid swing blocks. The muddy waters of the Mersey were lashed into foam by the slowly revolving paddle wheels. At the stern, the screw beat the waves with its 4 blades. The 2 engines, entirely independent of each other, were in complete working order. Towards 5 o'clock a small steamer, intended as a shore boat for the Great Eastern, came alongside. Her movable engine was first hoisted on board by means of 13 windlasses, but as for the steamer herself, she could not be embarked. Her steel hull was so heavy that the davits to which it was attached bent under the weight. Undoubtedly this would not have occurred had they supported them with lifts. Therefore they were obliged to abandon the steamer, but there still remained on the Great Eastern a string of 16 boats hanging to the davits. Everything was finished by evening. Not a trace of mud was visible on the well-swept boulevards, for an army of sweepers had been at work. There was a full cargo. Provisions, goods, and coal filled the steward's room, the store, and the coal houses. However, the steamer had not yet sunk to the load waterline and did not draw the necessary 33 feet. It was an inconvenient position for the wheels, for the paddles not being sufficiently immersed caused a great diminution in the speed. Nevertheless, it was possible to set sail, and I went to bed with the hope of starting next day. I was not disappointed, for at break of dawn I saw the English, French, and American flags floating from the masts. Chapter 3. The Great Eastern was indeed preparing to sail. Already volumes of black smoke were issuing from the 5 chimneys, and hot steam filled the engine rooms. Some sailors were brightening up the 4 great fog cannons which were to salute Liverpool as we sailed by. The top men climbed the yards, disentangled the rigging, and tightened the shrouds on the thick ropes fastened to the barricades. About 11 o'clock the carpenters and painters put the finishing touches to their work, and then embarked on board the tender which awaited them. As soon as there was a sufficient pressure, the steam rushed into the cylinders of the rudder engine, and the engineers had the pleasure of seeing that this ingenious contrivance was an entire success. The weather was fine, with bright gleams of sunshine darting through the rapidly moving clouds. There must have been a strong breeze at sea, but we did not feel it. 15 the officers were all dispersed about the deck, making preparations for getting under sail. The ship's officers were composed of the captain, the first officer, 2 assistant officers, 5 lieutenants, of whom one was a Frenchman, M.H., and a volunteer who was also French. Captain Anderson holds a high place in the commercial marine of England. It is to him we are indebted for the laying of the transatlantic cable, though it is true that if he succeeded where his predecessors had failed, it was because he worked under more favourable circumstances, having the Great Eastern at his command. Be it as it may, his success gained for him the title of Sir. I found him to be a very agreeable commander. He was a man of about 50 years of age, with that tawny complexion which remains unchanged by weather or age. A thorough Englishman, with a tall figure, a broad smiling face and merry eyes. Walking with a quiet dignified step, his hands never in his pockets, always irreproachably gloved and elegantly dressed, and invariably with a little piece of his white handkerchief peeping out of the pocket of his blue and gold-laced overcoat. The first officer presented a singular contrast to Captain Anderson, and his appearance is easily described. An active little man, with a very sunburnt skin, a black beard almost covering his face, and legs which defied every lurch 16 of the vessel, a skilful, energetic seaman, he gave his orders in a clear, decided tone, the boatswain repeating them with a voice like the roaring of a hoarse lion. The second officer's name was W. I think he was a naval officer, on board the Great Eastern by special permission. He had all the appearance of a regular jack-tar. Besides the ship officers, the engines were under the command of a chief engineer, assisted by 8 or 10 engineering officers, and a battalion of 250 men, some stokers, others oilers, who hardly ever left the engine rooms. This army of men was well occupied night and day, having 10 boilers with 10 furnaces, and about 100 fires to attend to. As for the crew of the steamship proper, what with quartermasters, top men, steersmen, and cabin boys, it comprised about 100 men, and besides these, there were 200 stewards employed for serving the passengers. Every man was at his post. The pilot who was to conduct the vessel out of the Mersey had been on board since the evening before. I saw also a French pilot, who was to make the passage with us, and on her return to take the steamship into anchorage at Brest. "I begin to think we shall sail today," said I to Lieutenant H. 17 We are only waiting for our passengers, replied my countryman. "Are there many?" 12 or 1300. At 11:30 the tender was hailed, laden with passengers, who, as I afterwards learnt, were Californians, Canadians, Americans, Peruvians, English, Germans, and 2 or 3 Frenchmen. Among the most distinguished were the celebrated Cyrus Field of New York, the Honorable John Rose of Canada, the Honorable J. Mac Alpine of New York, Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Cohen of San Francisco, Mr. and Mrs. Whitney of Montreal, Captain MCPH, and his wife. Among the French was the founder of the Great Eastern Freight Company, M. Jules 500, representative of the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, who had made a contribution of £20,000 to the fund. The tender ranged herself at the foot of a flight of steps, and then began the slow, interminable ascent of passengers and luggage. The first care of each passenger, when he had once set foot on the steamer, was to go and secure his place in the dining room. His card, or his name written on a scrap of paper, was enough to ensure his possession. Then began the slow, interminable ascent. I remained on deck, in order to notice all the details of 18 embarkation. At 12:30 the luggage was all on board, and I saw thousands of packages of every description, from chests large enough to contain a suite of furniture, to elegant little travelling cases and fanciful American and English trunks, heaped together pell-mell. All these were soon cleared from the deck, and stowed away in the storerooms. Workmen and porters returned to the tender, which steered off, after having blackened the side of the Great Eastern with her smoke. I was going back towards the bows, when suddenly I found myself face to face with the young man I had seen on Prince's landing stage. He stopped on seeing me, and held out his hand, which I warmly shook. "You Fabian," I cried, "you here?" "Even so, my dear friend. I was not mistaken then, it was really you I saw on the quay a day or two since." "It is most likely," replied Fabian, "but I did not see you." "And you are going to America?" "Certainly. Do you think I could spend a month's leave better than in travelling?" "How fortunate that you thought of making your tour in the Great Eastern." "It was not chance at all, my dear fellow. I read in the newspaper that you were one of the passengers, and as 19 we have not met for some years now, I came on board in order to make the passage with you." "Have you come from India?" "Yes, by the Gardivary, which arrived at Liverpool the day before yesterday." "And you are travelling, Fabian?" I asked, noticing his pale, sad face. "To divert my mind, if I can," interrupted Captain Mac Elwyn, warmly pressing my hand. Chapter 4. Fabian left me to look for his cabin, which, according to the ticket he held in his hand, was number 73 of the Grand Saloon series. At this moment, large volumes of smoke curled from the chimneys, the steam hissed with a deafening noise through the escape pipes, and fell in a fine rain over the deck. A noisy eddying of water announced that the engines were at work. We were at last going to start. First of all, the anchor had to be raised. The Great Eastern swung round with the tide, all was now clear, and Captain Anderson was obliged to choose this moment to set sail, for the width of the Great Eastern did not allow of her turning round in the Mersey. He was more master of his ship, and more certain of guiding her skilfully, in the midst of the numerous boats always plying on the river, when stemming the rapid current than when driven by the ebb tide. The least collision with this gigantic body would have proved disastrous. 21 to weigh anchor under these circumstances required considerable exertion, for the pressure of the tide stretched the chains by which the ship was moored, and besides this, a strong southwester blew with full force on her hull, so that it required powerful engines to hoist the heavy anchors from their muddy beds. An anchor boat intended for this purpose had just stoppered on the chains, but the windlasses were not sufficiently powerful, and they were obliged to use the steam apparatus which the Great Eastern had at her disposal. At the bows was an engine of 66 horsepower. In order to raise the anchors, it was only necessary to send the steam from the boilers into its cylinders to obtain immediately a considerable power, which could be directly applied to the windlass on which the chains were fastened. This was done, but powerful as it was, this engine was found insufficient, and 50 of the crew were set to turn the capstan with bars. Thus the anchors were gradually drawn in, but it was slow work. I was on the poop at the bows with several other passengers at this moment, watching the details of departure. Near me stood a traveller, who frequently shrugged his shoulders impatiently, and did not spare disparaging jokes on the tardiness of the work. He was a thin, nervous little man, with quick, restless eyes. A physiognomist can easily see that the things of this life always appeared on their funny side to this philosopher of Democrat school, for his risible muscles were never still for a moment. But without describing him further, I need only say I found him a very pleasant fellow traveller. "I thought until now, sir," said he to me, "that engines were made to help men, not men to help engines." I was going to reply to this wise observation when there was a loud cry, and immediately my companion and I were hurled towards the bows. Every man at the capstan bars was knocked down. Some got up again, others lay scattered on the deck. A ketch had broken, and the capstan being forced round by the frightful pressure of the chains, the men caught by the rebound were struck violently on the head and chest. Freed from their broken rope bands, the capstan bars flew in all directions like grape-shot, killing 4 sailors and wounding 12 others. Among the latter was the boatswain, a Scotchman from Dundee. The spectators hurried towards the unfortunate men. The wounded were taken to the hospital at the stern. As for the 4 already dead, preparations were immediately made to send them on shore. So lightly do Anglo-Saxons regard death, that this event made very little impression on board. These unhappy men, killed and wounded, were only tools, which could be replaced at very little expense. The 23 tender, already some distance off, was hailed, and in a few minutes she was alongside. Every man at the capstan bars was knocked down. I went towards the forepart of the vessel. The staircase had not yet been raised. The 4 corpses, enveloped in coverings, were let down and placed on the deck of the tender. One of the surgeons on board embarked to go with them to Liverpool, with injunctions to rejoin the Great Eastern as quickly as possible. The tender immediately sheered off, and the sailors went to the bows to wash the stains of blood from the deck. I ought to add that one of the passengers, slightly wounded by the breaking of the pinion, took advantage of this circumstance to leave by the tender. He had already had enough of the Great Eastern. I watched the little boat going off full steam, and turning round, I heard my ironical fellow traveller mutter, "A good beginning for a voyage." "A very bad one, sir," said I. "To whom have I the honour of speaking?" "To Dr. Dean Pitfudge." Chapter 5. The work of weighing anchors was resumed. With the help of the anchor boat the chains were eased, and the anchors at last left their tenacious depths. 1:15 sounded from the Birkenhead clock towers. The moment of departure could not be deferred if it was intended to make use of the tide. The captain and pilot went on the footbridge. One lieutenant placed himself near the screw signal apparatus, another near that of the paddle wheel, in case of the failure of the steam engine. 4 other steersmen watched at the stern, ready to put in action the great wheels placed on the gratings of the hatchings. The Great Eastern, making head against the current, was now only waiting to descend the river with the ebb tide. The order for departure was given, the paddles slowly struck the water, the screw bubbled at the stern, and the enormous vessel began to move. The greater part of the passengers on the poop were 25, gazing at the double landscape of Liverpool and Birkenhead, studded with manufactory chimneys. The Mersey, covered with ships, some lying at anchor, others ascending and descending the river, offered only a winding passage for our steamship. But under the hand of a pilot, sensible to the least inclinations of her rudder, she glided through the narrow passages, like a whaleboat beneath the oar of a vigorous steersman. At one time I thought that we were going to run foul of a brig, which was drifting across the stream, her bows nearly grazing the hull of the Great Eastern. But a collision was avoided, and when from the height of the upper deck I looked at this ship, which was not of less than 700 or 800 tons burden, she seemed to me no larger than the tiny boats which children play with on the lakes of Regent's Park or the Serpentine. It was not long before the Great Eastern was opposite the Liverpool landing stages, but the 4 cannons which were to have saluted the town were silent out of respect to the dead, for the tender was disembarking them at this moment. However, loud hurrahs replaced the reports which are the last expressions of national politeness. Immediately there was a vigorous clapping of hands and waving of handkerchiefs, with all the enthusiasm with which the English hailed the departure of every vessel, be it only a simple yacht sailing round a bay. But with what shouts they were answered, what echoes they called forth 26 from the quays. There were thousands of spectators on both the Liverpool and Birkenhead sides, and boats laden with sightseers swarmed on the Mersey. The sailors manning the yards of the Lord Clyde, lying at anchor opposite the docks, saluted the giant with their hearty cheers. But even the noise of the cheering could not drown the frightful discord of several bands playing at the same time. Flags were incessantly hoisted in honour of the Great Eastern, but soon the cries grew faint in the distance. Our steamship ranged near the Tripoli, a Cunard emigrant boat, which in spite of her 2,000 tons burden looked like a mere barge. Then the houses grew fewer and more scattered on both shores. The landscape was no longer blackened with smoke and brick. Walls, with the exception of some long regular buildings intended for workmen's houses, gave way to the open country, with pretty villas dotted here and there. Our last salutation reached us from the platform of the lighthouse and the walls of the bastion. At 3 o'clock the Great Eastern had crossed the bar of the Mersey and shaped her course down St. George's Channel. There was a strong sou'wester blowing and a heavy swell on the sea, but the steamship did not feel it. Towards 4 o'clock the captain gave orders to heave 27 to. The tender put on full steam to rejoin us as she was bringing back the doctor. When the boat came alongside, a rope ladder was thrown out by which he ascended, not without some difficulty. Our more agile pilot slid down by the same way into his boat, which was awaiting him, each rower provided with a cork jacket. Some minutes after he went on board a charming little schooner waiting to catch the breeze. Our course was immediately continued. Under the pressure of the paddles and the screw, the speed of the Great Eastern greatly increased. In spite of the wind ahead, she neither rolled nor pitched. Soon the shades of night stretched across the sea, and Holyhead Point was lost in the darkness. Chapter 6. The next day, the 27th of March, the Great Eastern coasted along the deeply indented Irish shore. I had chosen my cabin at the Bows. It was a small room well lighted by 2 skylights. A second row of cabins separated it from the first saloon, so that neither the noise of conversation nor the rattling of pianos, which were not wanting on board, could reach me. It was an isolated cabin. The furniture consisted of a sofa, a bedstead, and a toilet table. The next morning at 7 o'clock, having crossed the first 2 rooms, I went on deck. A few passengers were already pacing the upper decks. An almost imperceptible swell balanced the steamer. The wind, however, was high, but the sea, protected by the coast, was comparatively calm. From the poop of the smoking room, I perceived that long line of shore, the continual verdure of which has won for it the name of Emerald Coast. A few solitary 29 houses, a string of tide waiters, a wreath of white smoke curling from between 2 hills, indicating the passing of a train, an isolated signal post making grimacing gestures to the vessels at large, here and there animated the scene. The sea between us and the coast was of a dull green shade. There was a fresh breeze blowing, mists floated above the water like spray. Numerous vessels, brigs and schooners were awaiting the tide. Steamers puffing away their black smoke were soon distanced by the Great Eastern, although she was going at a very moderate speed. Soon we came in sight of Queenstown, a small calling place, before which several fishermen's boats were at work. It is here that all ships bound for Liverpool, whether steamers or sailing ships, throw out their dispatch bags, which are carried to Dublin in a few hours by an express train always in readiness. From Dublin they are conveyed across the Channel to Holyhead by a fast steamer, so that dispatches thus sent are 1 day in advance of the most rapid transatlantic steamers. Soon we came in sight of Queenstown. About 9 o'clock the bearings of the Great Eastern were west-northwest. I was just going on deck when I met Captain Mac Elwyn, accompanied by a friend, a tall, robust man with a light beard and long moustache which mingle with the whiskers and left the chin bare after the fashion of the day. This tall fellow was the exact type of an English officer. His figure was erect without stiffness, his look calm, his walk dignified but easy. His whole appearance seemed to indicate unusual courage, and I was not mistaken in him. "My friend Archibald Corsican," said Fabian to me, "a captain in the 22nd Regiment of the Indian Army like myself." Thus introduced, Captain Corsican and I bowed. Captain Corsican and I bowed. "We hardly saw each other yesterday, Fabian," said I, shaking Captain Mac Elwyn's hand. "We were in the bustle of departure, so that all I know about you is that it was not chance which brought you on board the Great Eastern. I must confess that if I have anything to do with your decision—" "Undoubtedly, my dear fellow," interrupted Fabian. "Captain Corsican and I came to Liverpool with the intention of taking our berths on board the China, a Cunard steamer, when we heard that the Great Eastern was going to attempt another passage from England to America. It was a chance we might not get again, and learning that you were on board I did not hesitate, as I had not seen you since we took that delightful trip in the Scandinavian states 3 years ago. So now you know how it was that the tender brought us here yesterday." 31, my dear Fabian, I replied. "I believe that neither Captain Corsican nor yourself will regret your decision, as a passage across the Atlantic in this huge boat cannot fail to be interesting even to you who are so little used to the sea. But now let us talk about yourself. Your last letter, and it is not more than 6 weeks since I received it, bore the Bombay postmark, so that I was justified in believing you were still with your regiment." "We were so 3 weeks ago," said Fabian, "leading the half-military, half-country life of Indian officers, employing most of our time in hunting. My friend here is a famed tiger killer. However, as we are both single and without family ties, we thought we would let the poor wild beasts of the peninsula rest for a time, while we came to Europe to breathe a little of our native air. We obtained a year's leave, and travelling by way of the Red Sea, Suez and France, we reached Old England with the utmost possible speed." "Old England," said Captain Corsican, smiling. "We are there no longer, Fabian. We are on board an English ship, but it is freighted by a French company, and it is taking us to America. 3 different flags float over our heads, signifying that we are treading on Franco-Anglo-American boards." "What does it matter?" replied Fabian, and a painful expression passed over his face. "What does it matter, so 32 long as it whiles away the time? Movement is life, and it is well to be able to forget the past and kill the present by continual change. In a few days I shall be at New York, where I hope to meet again my sister and her children, whom I have not seen for several years. Then we shall visit the Great Lakes, and descend the Mississippi as far as New Orleans, where we shall look for sport on the Amazon. From America we are going to Africa, where the lions and elephants will make the Cape their rendezvous, in order to celebrate the arrival of Captain Corsican. Finally, we shall return and impose on the sepoys the caprices of the metropolis. Fabian spoke with a nervous volubility, and his breast heaved. Evidently there was some great grief weighing on his mind, the cause of which I was as yet ignorant of, but with which Archibald seemed to be well acquainted. He evinced a warm friendship for Fabian, who was several years younger than himself, treating him like a younger brother, with a devotion which at times almost amounted to heroism. At this moment our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horn, which announced the 12:30 lunch. 4 times a day, to the great satisfaction of the passengers, this shrill horn sounded, at 8:30 for breakfast, 12:30 for lunch, 4 o'clock for dinner, and at 7 for tea. In a few minutes the long 33 streets were deserted, and soon the tables in the immense saloons were filled with guests. I succeeded in getting a place near Fabian and Captain Corsican. The dining rooms were provided with 4 long rows of tables, the glasses and bottles placed in swing racks kept perfectly steady. The roll of the steamer was almost imperceptible, so that the guests, men, women, and children, could eat their lunch without any fear. Numerous waiters were busy carrying round the tastily arranged dishes, and supplying the demands for wine and beer. The Californians certainly distinguished themselves by their proclivities for champagne. Near her husband sat an old laundress, who had found gold in the San Francisco washing tubs, emptying a bottle of champagne in no time. 2 or 3 pale, delicate-looking young ladies were eagerly devouring slices of red beef, and others discussing with evident satisfaction the merits of rhubarb tart, and see everyone worked away in the highest spirits. One could have fancied oneself at a restaurant in the middle of Paris instead of the open sea. Lunch over, the decks were again filled. People bowed and spoke to each other in passing as formally as if they were walking in Hyde Park. Children played and ran about, throwing their balls and bowling hoops as they might have done on the gravel walks of the Tuileries. The greater part of the men walked up and down smoking. The ladies, seated on folding chairs, worked, read, or talked together, whilst the 34 governesses and nurses looked after the children. A few corpulent Americans swung themselves backwards and forwards in their rocking chairs. The ship's officers were continually passing to and fro, some going to their watch on the bridge, others answering the absurd questions put to them by some of the passengers, whilst the tones of an organ and 2 or 3 pianos making a distracting discord reached us through the lulls in the wind. About 3 o'clock a loud shouting was heard. The passengers crowded on to the poop. The Great Eastern had ranged within 2 cable lengths of a vessel which she had overhauled. It was the Propontis, on her way to New York, which was saluting the giant of the seas on her passage, which compliment the giant returned. Land was still in sight at 4 o'clock, but hardly discernible through the mist which had suddenly surrounded us. Soon we saw the light of Fastinet Beacon, situated on an isolated rock. Night set in, during which we must have doubled Cape Clear, the most southerly point of Ireland. Chapter 7. I said that the length of the Great Eastern exceeded 2 hectometers. For the benefit of those partial to comparisons, I will add that it is a third longer than the Pont des Arts. In reality, this steamship measures 673 feet at the load waterline between the perpendiculars. The upper deck is 680 feet from stem to stern. That is to say, its length is double that of the largest transatlantic steamers. Its width amidships is about 71 feet, and behind the paddles about 107 feet. The hull of the Great Eastern is proof against the most formidable seas. It is double, and is composed of a number of cells placed between the deck and hold. Besides these, 13 compartments, separated by watertight partitions, increase the security against fire or the inlet of water. 10,000 tons of iron were used in the construction of this hull, and 0 rivets secured the iron plates on her sides. 36. The Great Eastern draws 30 feet of water with a cargo of 28,500 tons, and with a light cargo, fro to 30 feet. She is capable of receiving 10,000 passengers, so that out of the 373 principal districts in France, 274 are less populated than this floating sub-prefecture, with its average number of passengers. The lines of the Great Eastern are very elongated. Her straight stem is pierced with hawse holes, through which the anchor chains pass. No signs of dents or protuberances are to be seen on her finely cut bows, but the slight sweep of her rounded stern somewhat mars the general effect. From the deck rise 6 masts and 5 chimneys. The 3 masts in front are the foregigger and the foremast, both of them mizzenmasts and the mainmast. The last 3 astern are the after mainmast, mizzenmast, and aftergigger. The foremasts and the mainmasts carry the schooner sails, the topsails, and the gallant sails. The 4 other masts are only rigged with ordinary sails, the whole forming 5,400 square yards of good canvas. On the spacious mastheads of the second and third masts, a band of soldiers could easily maneuver. Of these 6 masts supported by shrouds and metallic backstays, the second, third, and fourth are made of sheet iron, and are really masterpieces of ironwork. At the base they measure 43 inches in diameter, and the largest, the 37 main mast, rises to the height of 207 French feet, which is higher than the towers of Notre Dame. As to the chimneys, the 2 belonging to the paddle engine and the 3 belonging to the screw, they are enormous cylinders, 90 feet high, supported by chains fastened to the upper deck. The arrangements with regard to the interior are admirable. The laundries and the crew's berths are shut off at the forepart. Then come the ladies' saloon and a grand saloon ornamented with lustres, swinging lamps and pictures. These magnificent rooms are lighted by side skylights, supported on elegant gilded pillars, and communicate with the upper deck by wide staircases with metallic steps and mahogany balusters. On deck are arranged 4 rows of cabins separated by a passage. Some are reached by a landing, others on a lower story by private staircases. At the stern the 3 immense dining rooms run in the same direction as the cabins. A passage leads from the saloons at the stern to those at the bows round the paddle engine, between its sheet iron partitions and the ship's offices. The engines of the Great Eastern are justly considered as masterpieces, I was going to say of clockwork, for there is nothing more astonishing than to see this enormous machine working with the precision and ease of a clock, a singular contrast to the screw, 38, which works rapidly and furiously, as though getting itself into a rage. Independently of these 2 engines, the Great Eastern possesses 6 auxiliary ones to work the capstans, so that it is evident steam plays an important part on board. Such is this steamship without equal and known everywhere, which however did not hinder a French captain from making this naive remark in his logbook. Passed a ship with 6 masts and 5 chimneys, supposed to be the Great Eastern. Chapter 8. On Wednesday night the weather was very bad, my balance was strangely variable, and I was obliged to lean with my knees and elbows against the sideboard to prevent myself from falling. Portmanteaus and bags came in and out of my cabin. An unusual hubbub reigned in the adjoining saloon, in which 200 or 300 packages were making expeditions from one end to the other, knocking the tables and chairs with loud crashes. Doors slammed, the boards creaked, the partitions made that groaning noise peculiar to pine wood. Bottles and glasses jingled together in their racks, and a cataract of plates and dishes rolled about on the pantry floors. I heard the irregular roaring of the screw, and the wheels beating the water, sometimes entirely immersed, and at others striking the empty air. By all these signs I concluded that the wind had freshened, and the steamship was no longer indifferent to the billows. At 6 o'clock next morning, after passing a sleepless 40 night, I got up and dressed myself, as well as I could with one hand, while with the other I clutched at the sides of my cabin, for without support it was impossible to keep one's feet, and I had quite a serious struggle to get on my overcoat. I left my cabin, and helping myself with hands and feet through the billows of luggage, I crossed the saloon, scrambling up the stairs on my knees, like a Roman peasant devoutly climbing the steps of the Scala Santa of Pontius Pilate, and at last, reaching the deck, I hung on firmly to the nearest kevel. No land in sight. We had doubled Cape Clear in the night, and around us was that vast circumference bounded by the line, where water and sky appear to meet. The slate-coloured sea broke in great foamless billows. The Great Eastern struck amidships, and supported by no sail rolled frightfully, her bare masts describing immense circles in the air. There was no heaving to speak of, but the rolling was dreadful. It was impossible to stand upright. The officer on watch, clinging to the bridge, looked as if he was in a swing. From kevel to kevel, I managed to reach the paddles on the starboard side. The deck was damp and slippery from the spray and mist. I was just going to fasten myself to a stanchion of the bridge when a body rolled at my feet. It was Dr. Pitferge, my quaint friend. He scrambled on to his knees and looking at me said, 41, that's all right. The amplitude of the arc described by the sides of the Great Eastern is 40 degrees, that is, 20 degrees below the horizontal and 20 above it. Indeed, cried I, laughing not at the observation, but at the circumstances under which it was made. Yes, replied the doctor. During the oscillation, the speed of the sides is 59 inches per second. A transatlantic boat half the size takes, but the same time to recover her equilibrium. Then, replied I, since that is the case, there is an excess of stability in the Great Eastern. For her, yes, but not for her passengers, answered Dean Pitford gaily, for you see they come back to the horizontal quicker than they care for. The doctor, delighted with his repartee, raised himself, and holding each other up we managed to reach a seat on the poop. Dean Pitford had come off very well with only a few bruises, and I congratulated him on his lucky escape, as he might have broken his neck.